welcome to Your South Florida, your source for conversations that matter to our community. I'm Pam Giganti. Thanks for joining us. President Donald J. Trump in office just 2 weeks and is moving quickly to fulfill his campaign promises with a series of nominations, appointments, and executive orders, including one that has drawn condemnation from leaders around the world and sparked protests across our nation and right here in South Florida. It's the president's executive order banning immigration from 7 primarily Muslim countries for the next 90 days, Syrian refugees for 120 days, plus calling for an end to sanctuary cities where officials refuse to find and hand over illegal immigrants for deportation. Less than 24 hours after the president enacted the order, Miami-Dade Mayor Carlos Jimenez ordered police to comply by holding or turning over any violators to Customs and Border Patrol. The reason? He didn't want to put $355 million in federal discretionary funding at risk. Joining me now to talk more about all of these issues is law professor James Willits of Nova Southeastern University, who specializes in immigration, constitutional law, and human rights. James, great to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pam. Good to be here.
So much for us to talk about as we saw so many protests across the nation and here in South Florida. A lot of people very emotional about what had happened with that immigration ban. We heard the incredible stories of people who were en route to the United States, some of them with visas, who were literally turned away. So how legal is what the president did going forward? Because we actually saw federal judges in many states having to jump in and make a legal decision and say, oh, if you're already here or you're being held in detention, you won't be deported. Kind of caused like a legal mess in a way, did it not?
Absolutely. And Pam, you've accurately identified that in fact, all judges and legal authorities who have examined the issue have determined that, in fact, it's illegal what was done. I think what's a greater concern, even more than the legality of it, is the process by which these executive actions were developed. So apparently, there are now reports from Marco Rubio's office, other people, that in fact the administration had spoken with staffers in Congress and asked them to help prepare the executive orders and asked them to sign confidentiality agreements, non-disclosure agreements, so they could not even speak to their own bosses about what they were doing for the executive branch. This raises serious separation of powers concerns that we've never encountered before. So frequently presidents do things that could be open to questionable constitutional validity. Obama's executive actions frequently were challenged for their constitutional validity, but we've never seen a president before engage in a process that has so little disregard for involving the different branches of the governments in formulating policy and thinking through the ramifications of those policies.
And talking about how all of this went down, it was as if he signed it, it went into effect immediately. It caused a lot of confusion at the airports. It sort of put people in a bind, as you said. And when the president was questioned about that, his administration came out. Of course, he tweeted about it, and we have some of those tweets as well, him saying why he did it the way he did. In fact, one of the tweets says, if the ban were announced with a 1 week notice, the bad would rush into our country during that week. A lot of bad dudes out there. So he was defending the fact that there really wasn't a grace period, if you will, or some sort of announcement, okay, within 24 hours, this is going to happen. There's a lot of debate on both sides about having done that.
Well, that's not the way the government works. We're a system of 3 branches of government, and things should be done in a thoughtful manner with an awareness of the possible consequences. And quite frankly, you see the administration make a policy one night. It turns out to be a disaster. You have people hold up at airports, you have injunctions against the policies, and then you have the administration trying to defend it, backtrack, et cetera. That's no way to run a government.
And what about all these executive orders? I mean, we've had one after another. I mean, is he allowed to do that? Where's Congress in all of this? Don't they help to make some of these decisions?
Well, let's separate out the different executive orders.
Okay.
So there's executive orders regarding the sanctuary cities. And sanctuary cities simply means that the city officials will not conduct the job of the federal government in enforcing immigration law. They certainly can't interfere with that. That would be illegal on the part of local police, et cetera. But the 10th Amendment specifically provides that the federal government cannot commandeer local officials to do the federal government's job. And in fact, that's a conservative doctrine that was developed by the court during its most recent conservative phase. So this is a very solid, concrete conservative doctrine that the federal government cannot take over local officials to do their job. If federal officials want to come in and enforce an immigration law, that's a completely different issue.
So let's bring up, if we can, then what happened with Miami-Dade County Mayor Carlos Jimenez. And he actually put out a statement because when he was one of the mayors of a large metropolitan area to come out first and say, we're not a sanctuary community, and then there were a lot of protests, as you know, and he put out quite a lengthy statement saying, I'm an immigrant, I understand fears, et cetera, of the community. His statement goes on to say, I would like our residents to understand that this order will not result in widespread and indefinite detentions of immigrants. In 2016, approximately 80,000 people were arrested in Miami-Dade County, and of those, only 174 were detained. There is no change in broader policy. So he's basically coming out and reassuring the residents of Miami-Dade County that you're not going to be rounded up and given over to ICE and to Border Patrol. And you're saying because that's not the job of the county police, correct?
Right, and Mayor Manny Diaz has come out and condemned the initial articulation of the policy by Mayor Jimenez. And Mayor Jimenez has somewhat softened his position and said, we're not a sanctuary city, so there's no issue here. We're not in any way doing anything that's in violation of federal law, et cetera. San Francisco has filed suit against the federal government in a case called San Francisco v. Trump. And their argument is that the 10th Amendment prohibits the federal government from punishing San Francisco for not using its city employees to enforce federal immigration policy. And like I said before, that's an established doctrine now on the Supreme Court and was established by the conservative members of the Supreme Court.
Okay. We have one of our viewers, Paul. He lives in the Brickell area. He's weighing in with a comment, and here's his take. Listen.
Obviously, we need to keep dangerous people out, but the current ban, none of the countries that the ban applies to are countries where any terrorists have caused any acts in the country.
Yeah, so once again, the ban on refugees is in effect for 120 days, and then we have this ban 90 days in effect for people coming from those 7 predominantly Muslim countries. So your comment to what he's asking, that some of these other countries that weren't included in the ban are countries where we've seen terrorists come from. So why the disparity there? And then after the ban expires, what then?
Well, okay, now this deals with the constitutionality of the executive orders dealing with the ban on individuals coming from these countries. Some commentators have noted that it excludes countries where terrorists have come from, such as Saudi Arabia, where Trump owns significant businesses. So it's interesting that none of the countries from which people are excluded are countries where Trump has any business dealings. And the countries that were excluded, he does have business dealings. So there doesn't seem to be a consistent pattern to it. I know the administration has tried to defend it by saying that some of these countries were targeted by the Obama administration, et cetera. But there does not seem to be any kind of process by which they've made a rational determination that these are the appropriate countries to target. And I think, as the speaker mentioned, as the Miami speaker mentioned, that the terrorists in 9/11 came from Saudi Arabia, or most of them did. And Saudi Arabia is not even on the list. So it appears to be arbitrary. It appears to make it as if Trump is doing something, just to do something.
Well, making one of his campaign promises to come through.
Exactly.
And then going forward, obviously something we're going to be watching is this confirmation of a Supreme Court pick, Neil Gorsuch. He seems like somebody who's sort of moderate. Yeah.
Well, he's
conservative and moderate, right?
Well, he's been described as a justice and a judge in the mold of Antonin Scalia, who is not exactly moderate, he's very conservative. He's a smoother conservative. I don't think he's as acerbic as Scalia. So in that sense, I guess he'll be maybe easier to swallow, but his policies are extremely conservative. They're very consistent with Scalia's. In fact, to some extent, they're more conservative than Scalia's positions.
So you see a fight ahead.
There could very well be a fight ahead, although he may be easier to confirm because, again, he's more gentlemanly, he's more polite, he's smoother.
Which we don't always see with Donald Trump.
Right, that's right, that's right.
All right, James Willits, thank you so very much for joining us. We look forward to having you back on again.
Thank you very much, Pam.
welcome to your South Florida, your source for conversations that matter to our community. I'm Pam Gigante. Thanks for joining us. President Donald J. Trump in office just 2 weeks and is moving quickly to fulfill his campaign promises with a series of nominations, appointments, and executive orders, including one that has drawn condemnation from leaders around the world and sparked protests, plus calling for an end to sanctuary cities where officials refuse to find and hand over illegal immigrants for deportation. Less than 24 hours after the president enacted the order, Miami-Dade Mayor Carlos Jimenez ordered police to comply by holding or turning over any violators to Customs and Border Patrol. The reason? He didn't want to put $355 million in federal discretionary funding at risk. That's across our nation and right here in South Florida. It's the president's executive order banning immigration from 7 primarily Muslim countries for the next 90 days, Syrian refugees for 120 days,